Hello everyone, my name is Erin Lomax. I am the Education Specialist at the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystems exhibit at the St. Lucie County Aquarium in Fort Pierce, Florida. Today we're going to be exploring mangroves and mangrove ecosystems. There is an activity packet that goes with this module. You will find it directly below this video. All of the materials that you need to complete that activity are included. This activity can be done completely from home. However, if you do have any questions, I encourage you to reach out to the education team at the aquarium. Our contact information will be at the end of this video. So this module is best for grades 5 through 7. We're going to start with a short video overview. As I said, the activity packet can be found below this video. And once you're finished, you can check your answers with the answer key, which is also included in this module. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So what is a mangrove? A mangrove is a woody tree or shrub that grows within reach of the tides in salty soil along tropical and subtropical coastlines around the world. We find 54 true species of mangroves worldwide. That includes the 3 species of true mangroves that we find here in Florida. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And it's important to note that mangrove species are not necessarily closely related to each other, but they're classified as mangroves because they all share some common characteristics. So what makes a mangrove a mangrove? Well, first, they are adapted to live in and directly next to salt water. Now, this can include brackish water areas as well. And remember that brackish water is kind of a mixture of salt water and fresh water. So brackish water is not quite as salty as salt water, but it's saltier than fresh water. It's a mixture of the two. Mangroves also play a major role in the ecosystems they inhabit. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And also, mangroves are biologically different from trees that can only survive on dry land, and that's because mangroves have some special adaptations that allow them to grow in the areas that we find them. And again, we'll explore that a little bit more as we go forward. So let's talk about the mangrove species that we find here in Florida. Probably the most recognizable is the red mangrove. Red mangroves are pretty easy to identify by their prop roots. So prop roots is a root system that props the tree up out of the water. It provides stability for the tree, and it allows the roots to obtain oxygen from the air. Red mangroves always grow along saltwater or brackish coastlines in either the water or in the mud or the sand. You might sometimes hear red mangroves referred to as walking trees, since it looks like it's walking across the water. And red mangroves produce something called a propagule. And here's a picture of them right there. Now, this looks like a seed pod. However, propagules are actually living trees. When the propagule falls off of the parent mangrove tree, it can float in the water for up to a year, maybe a little bit longer, before taking root. Another species that we see commonly in Florida are the black mangroves, and black mangroves usually grow either directly behind red mangroves or very close to them along the shoreline, and they're also easy to identify by their root systems. They have roots that are called pneumatophores, and there's kind of a close-up picture of pneumatophores of a black mangrove tree. These are specialized roots that grow upwards. They grow out of the bottom and up through the water or the mud to reach the air and to provide oxygen for the root system. This is because the substrate that we find them in, and in red mangroves as well, they tend to be substrates that might be oxygen poor. So sand, mud, substrates like that tend to be sort of stagnant without a whole lot of oxygen. So those root systems need to have adaptations in order to get oxygen to their roots. Now, white mangroves can be a little bit trickier to identify. We tend to find white mangroves growing a little further back from the water in an area that we call the high intertidal zone. So these are areas that really high tides can reach, like the high tides that we get in the springtime that tend to be higher than during the rest of the year. But it's mostly dry in between those really high tides. In Florida, we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day, roughly just over 6 hours apart. And when I'm talking about tides, remember I'm referring to the regular rising and falling of the ocean due to the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun. So the easiest way to identify white mangroves is through their leaves and their blooms. So their leaves tend to be more rounded in shape than a red or black mangrove leaf, and they have small nodules above the leaf called nectaries. And the blooms that white mangroves produce are kind of delicate white flowers that are really pretty, and there's a picture of them right there on the left. So surviving in saltwater, how do trees grow in and around salty water? Don't trees need fresh water to live? Well, yes, they do. But mangroves have unique adaptations for surviving in saltwater. So red mangroves have specialized membranes in their root systems that prevents up to 90% of salt in saltwater from entering their vascular system. So we call red mangroves excluders since they exclude salt from entering their root system. Now, black and white mangroves are called excretors because while these trees can't prevent the uptake of salt water through their root systems, they'll push salt out through the pores on their leaves, and this is called excretion. Sometimes if you look really closely on the leaves of the black or white mangrove, you might actually see small salt crystals like you do in this picture on the right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mangrove ecosystems. So according to the Smithsonian Institution, mangroves cover up to 77,000 square miles of the earth. And in Florida, we have over 700 miles of mangrove coverage. So mangrove forests support a huge diversity of life, either by the animals that consume the leaves, through animals living in the branches of mangroves like nesting birds, and even organisms that live on the roots like sponges, snails, barnacles, oysters, and more. So fallen leaves from mangroves are the base of this food web. So mangrove ecosystems are considered to be a detritus-based food web. They support a detritus-based food web. So there are animals that eat the fallen leaves themselves, and these animals are called detritivores because they consume detritus, which is dead organic material like fallen leaves. Mangrove ecosystems are also considered to be nursery habitats, and that's because we tend to find not only a lot of young animals there that will move out of that area once they grow a little bit larger, but a lot of these animals only spend part of their lives in those mangrove ecosystems before they move out into deeper water. This would include certain species of shrimp, certain species of crabs, and fish as well. So they'll move out of that ecosystem once they're a little older, bigger, and they're ready for deeper water. So even if a bird species does not nest in the branches of the mangroves, many species of birds will use mangrove areas to hunt for food. And for swimming species like fish and swimming crabs, the roots of the mangroves are a great place to find food and to also find protection from predators. So there's a lot of benefits to mangroves. There's almost too many to list, so we're just going to hit a few of the most important ones. And the first one I want to talk about is carbon storage. So one of the important things that mangroves do for our environment is to absorb and store carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. So carbon dioxide can come from many different sources, including greenhouse gases that are produced by fossil fuels like gasoline in our cars cars or our airplanes. And like other plants, mangroves use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the process of photosynthesis to build tissues in their leaves, their roots, and their trunks. So why is this important? Well, carbon dioxide can trap heat in the atmosphere. And so if there's too much carbon dioxide, then the planet becomes warmer than it should be. Now, you may have heard the term global warming or climate change. And when the planet is too warm, it can cause a lot of problems. It can cause changes in weather, droughts, and the melting of polar ice caps, which leads to rising sea levels. But mangroves can store that carbon and keep it locked away so that it isn't released into the atmosphere. And 1 acre of mangrove forest can store up to 1,400 pounds of carbon every year. And remember, I said that worldwide, over 77,000 square miles are covered by mangroves. So you can imagine how much carbon can be stored from all of those mangroves. Now, mangroves also help to protect our shoreline because they are shore stabilizers. And what this means is that the roots actually help hold the shoreline in place to prevent erosion. So this is especially important during things like hurricanes. When there are a lot of heavy waves and strong winds, mangroves help to break up the wave energy and to decrease the storm surge. Another benefit is that they are a source of food, and not only a source of food for the animals who are living in those areas, but for us as humans as well. An estimated 75% of fish that are caught for food spend part of their lives in mangrove habitats, or they rely on food that did. We also rely on mangroves to help us with water quality. So organisms that live on mangrove roots, like oysters, help to filter the water by consuming suspended particles in the water, and that can include things like heavy metals or other forms of human-made pollution. And by filtering all of those suspended particles, it actually helps increase our water quality. Over time, the sediments that mangroves trap can also become new land. Now, just like there's a lot of benefits to mangroves, there's a lot of threats too. There's a lot of threats to mangroves. So let's just hit a few of them here. The biggest threat to mangroves is actually us. It's humans. And that's because humans have removed or destroyed over 6,000 miles of mangrove forests around the world just since 1996. Sometimes mangroves are removed because humans want to build homes, businesses, or other structures in those areas where mangroves are. Sometimes mangroves are removed because humans want to create farms to grow fish or shrimp. This is called aquaculture. Now, aquaculture itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing, since we can raise fish and shellfish to eat instead of harvesting them from the wild and contributing to those overfishing issues. However, there are some countries that practice poor aquaculture techniques that can result in environmental degradation. Now, in other countries like the United States, strict environmental laws forbid these types of environmentally unfriendly practices, and we work to protect mangroves. Human pollution can also damage or kill mangroves if the pollution is in the soil, which can keep mangroves from developing and growing properly. And then sometimes mangroves are chopped down in other parts of the world for their wood and used as construction materials, so for houses or bridges, etc. Now, although mangroves can actually help us curb some of the effects of climate change, like we just talked about, mangroves are not immune to it. Okay, so as sea levels rise, mangroves need to grow farther inland from where they've been historically. But in certain places, it's not possible due to human development, things like houses and buildings and roads. And because of the warming climate, mangroves are also beginning to grow farther north than they used to. Now, because there's not many plant species that can tolerate the salty conditions that mangroves can, you'd think that mangrove areas wouldn't be very impacted by invasive species, but they are. Invasive species are organisms that are not native to an area, but they begin to live in that area, usually due to introduction by humans, either on purpose or by accident. But mangrove forests and swamps are impacted by invasive species in Florida, like the Brazilian pepper tree, which is pictured right there. So Brazilian pepper trees thrive in coastal habitats, so they actually compete with mangroves for space and nutrients. So what can you do to help mangroves? Well, there's a few things. First off, don't litter. And don't add more pollution to an area. So make sure you clean up after yourself and your pets. Don't leave your trash there after visiting a mangrove area. And don't disturb mangroves that are growing, including never cutting mangroves without a special permit. All right, so now it's your turn. As I said, the activity packet can be found right below this video. Once you're finished, go ahead and check your answers with the answer key. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. The best way to reach us is through email. Our email address is smseducation@si.edu. Thank you guys so much and have a great day.